And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Pardon me. Now, as you already know, I was in the process of preparing for my debate with Dr. Richard Carrier, which was supposed to take place tomorrow. But as a result, of the horrific hurricanes there in North Carolina and in Florida. The host of the debate and sponsor of the debate, Derek Lambert, he had to get out of town. He had to get out of Florida. And so we have rescheduled the debate for October the 26th. That's the plan at this particular time. But all of that is the reason for this screen back here. And yes, if you're noticing black stuff on my fingers, I worked on one of my old vehicles yesterday. I didn't use my rubber gloves, and I was using some stuff called POR15. Those of you who are gearheads know all about that stuff. It's the most fantastic rust preventative sealer that I know of. And any of you POR15 people watching, you can send me a contribution for the plug here. Anyway, once you get it on you, if you don't use lacquer thinner immediately, the stuff has to grow off. Now, I had intended, to be honest about it, to take my pocket knife and scrape this off, but I forgot to do it. So I can get rid of some of that. But if you're offended by me having a little bit of dirt on my hands, well, that's just too bad, because I love to work on my old cars. Okay, back to it. As promised, I will continue today with my videos, and I am doing today a second examination of the book of Daniel and Antiochus Epiphanes. And the reason I'm doing so is because Brian Hodge, in his book, The Problems with Preterism, makes many, many arguments. I mean, early on in the book, that the problem with preterists is they fail to understand a couple of things. Point number one, the book of Daniel, Daniel 9, Daniel 2, Daniel 12, pardon me, Daniel 7, all of these, quote, prophecies in the book of Daniel are really not prophecies after all. No, they were written actually after the fact. And point number two, that fact is that what Daniel was talking about was not the coming of a Messiah, not the coming of Jesus at all. Now, to be honest about it, I don't know how he would deal with Daniel chapter 7 and the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, and Daniel 7, 13 and 14, since Jesus, in something like 26 different places in the Gospels, draws on quotes from Daniel 7, 13 and 14, to speak of his coming in judgment on the clouds of heaven. And so it's really perplexing how Brian Hodge can say, well, you see, Daniel's not predictive, and it's not predictive of Messiah. It's talking about the coming of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, again, how are you going to deal with Daniel 7? But beyond that, since so many of Mr. Hodge's problems with preterism are founded and grounded in his presuppositional view about Daniel and Antiochus Epiphanes. And by the way, so far, and I must confess, I haven't read the entirety of the book so far, all right? But so far, he hasn't taken the time to carefully exegete why he believes that Antiochus Epiphanes is the focus of attention of the book of Daniel. He simply asserts it. he says something like, it is more than obvious that this is not dealing with Jesus. It's more than obvious that Daniel is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and the things that had already been done. And so, this to him is one of the keys to refuting full preterism. So let me put it like this. If it is true, and I'm going to focus right now on Daniel chapter 9, 24. If it is true that Daniel 9 truly is messianic, truly is about Jesus, his coming, and his work, and the last days fate of Israel. If it's true that it's not primarily about Antiochus Epiphanes and his attempted pogrom against the Jews, then one of the very foundation stones, or if you please, one of the pillars of Mr. Hodge's entire argument crumbles into dust. That's how important it is to refute his underlying a priori view of the book of Daniel. Because so much of what he argues is based upon whether or not Daniel 9 is about Antiochus Epiphanes. So, with that in mind, and I could expand this a great deal, but I'm going to try to keep this presentation today to a single presentation. Now, let me inform you, I have done a series of DVDs that is dealing with the end of the 70 weeks of Daniel. In that series of DVDs, I go into great detail. What I'm going to do this morning is not even close to what I do in the DVD series, okay? But it is an extended series of videos, or you can have it in MP3 form. You can have it you can have it either in DVD form, or you can download it on my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. You can purchase your own download, you can purchase your own DVD, or you can put it on a stick and have it for your own ease of listening as often as you like. So go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Just go to the store and do a search for the DVDs or whatever of the end of Daniel 9. It's an amazing series. And to be honest about it, I'm not aware of anyone that's done anything nearly as extensive as I have in this series. Okay, so with all of that in mind, Daniel has been reading the book of Jeremiah. And he understands from Jeremiah chapter 29 that Judah and Jerusalem were supposed to be in captivity for 70 years. He does the calculations, and it's absolutely fascinating to me that men like Richard Carrier says, Daniel got the timing wrong. So we're supposed to believe that a Jew intimately familiar with Jeremiah 29, intimately familiar with the Babylonian captivity, got his timing wrong. Wow, that's a rather bold comment, don't you think? But Jeremiah prays and asks to the Lord, when will we be delivered? He is essentially told that the ultimate deliverance will be for 70 weeks. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I just simply want you to notice 70, I'm reading from the New American Standard Translation. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people, for your holy city. Number one, there are 6 constituent elements of this incredible prophecy. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. The New American Standard says most holy place. There's a lot of debate about this. I'll be really honest, I vacillate on this. But let's just break this down a little bit. Mr. Hodge believes that this prophecy, and he doesn't believe it's an actual prophecy. Keep this in mind. He believes that everything enumerated in Daniel chapter 9 verse 24 had actually already taken place. This, quote, prophet, he doesn't believe it's an actual prophet named Daniel. He says it's some person who is writing in the midst of or immediately after the events of Antiochus Epiphanes, is using the name Daniel, claiming to be the prophet Daniel, and Mr. Hodge never tells us if he believes there really was a person named Daniel. But nonetheless, this person, in order to give Israel comfort in the midst of Antiochus's pogroms, persecutions, once again is using Daniel's name. He writes the book as if it's a prophecy, when in reality everything's either already taking place or already passed. Now look, let me say this. If you've got this man claiming to be Daniel, and if in fact, as Mr. Hodge claims, he's writing after the fact of the reinstitution, restoration of the temple, rededication of the temple, if he is writing after the death of Onias, the great high priest, if he is writing after the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, why would he even pose it as a prophecy? Why would he not instead simply write something like, we praise the Lord our God for his deliverance, that we have retaken the temple, we've rededicated the temple. Glory to our God who has given us the victory. Why not write it? Let me reiterate this. This is incredible. You got to catch the power of this. If, once again, I apologize, if, as Mr. Hodge says, Daniel is writing ex eventu, after the fact of Antiochus Epiphanes, why write it as if it's a prophecy? Why not simply praise God for the deliverance? I mean, after all, if Antiochus is already dead, why not rejoice in that? It seems to me that Mr. Hodge has taken a horribly anachronistic view of Daniel 9. And by the way, the same is true of men like the great scholar John Collins, upon whom Mr. Hodge draws. All right? It seems to me this is an entirely anachronistic position to take, and it makes no sense whatsoever. So let's very quickly, in the time left, look at the elements that are there. Now, let me point out, there are some events in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes that bear a resemblance to what happened in the time of Jesus. I'm not denying that. Antiochus Epiphanes set up an abomination in the temple. He offered a pig on the altar of the temple as an offering to Zeus. Actually, his commander did, but nonetheless. And Jesus draws on that abomination of desolation, but I think there are two abominations of desolation in Daniel. I think there's one in Daniel 9. I think there's one in Daniel chapter 11. That doesn't destroy anything. That doesn't disturb anything. But look at what Daniel foretold. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people, for your holy city, to finish the transgression. Now, In Daniel chapter 8, verse 23, we are told that Israel would, in fact, fill up the measure of their sin in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. I don't have a problem with that. Guess what? Jesus said Israel is going to fill up the measure of her sin in his generation. Do we have two different filling up the measure of sin? Yes, we do. That's one of the reasons why I say we can have two abominations without disturbing the text in any way whatsoever. Anyway, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity. Well, this is where it really gets troublesome for Mr. Hodge and for the Antiochene view. Because you see, as I pointed out before, Onias the third or fourth, whichever enumeration you prefer, I've seen Onias referred to as the fourth, and I've seen him referred to as the third, whichever. Okay, he was the last, according to many scholars, the last duly authorized, properly properly sanctified, holy high priest. Okay, well, Antiochus's own surrogate high priests, Jason and Menelaus, killed Onias. Jason bought the high priesthood, which disqualifies him which disqualifies him from making the atonement, which disqualifies him from putting away sin. He's guilty of sin. Menelaus was likewise a partner in the killing of Onias. He cannot make an atonement because he is such a sinner. Well, the argument is made that Judas Maccabeus, when he reconquered the city, when he purified or was going to purify the altar, that he chose some goodly men. Now that raises all sorts of questions. According to the historical sources, according to the Jews, Onias was the last qualified priest. So was Judas simply choosing the best that he could get? But men who were not actually, truly qualified? Well, if that be the case, then they can't put away sin. They cannot make atonement. However, Jesus, the great high priest, after the order of Melchizedek, has made the atonement. Romans 5, 9 and 10, Hebrews chapter 9. So if, and I would prefer to say since, it cannot be validated that the priests appointed by Judas Maccabeus were actually qualified high priests, then it's not possible to go to Daniel chapter 9 and to say, well, these priests, number one, we know Jason and Menelaus couldn't do it, okay, because they're murderers. But secondly, unless it can be proven that the men who followed Jason and Menelaus were in some way, somehow, truly, genuinely qualified to be offering on the altar, then they could not make the atonement and could not put away sin. But that's the least of Mr. Hodge's position of problems for his position on Daniel chapter 9. Notice, this to me is really, this to me is the killer, ladies and gentlemen. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, we are told, well, with the Maccabees, the Torah was restored. The temple was restored. Ladies and gentlemen, Judaism was never the same from Antiochus Epiphanes until the time of Christ. As I've already pointed out, the priesthood was corrupted. It was one person after another purchasing the high priesthood. This was true under Herod the Great. The Romans kept the high priestly garments. There is simply no way to affirm historically, biblically, theologically, there is no way in this world to properly, truthfully claim that everlasting righteousness in any way whatsoever was established even by the reconquering of Jerusalem, even by the recapturing of the temple, even by the purification of the priesthood. Because, let me reiterate, the priesthood from that point on was corrupt. If you've got a corrupt priesthood, ladies and gentlemen, there is no way in this world that everlasting righteousness is established. It's just not possible. And here's something to note. In the New Testament, what do we find? Well, we find Paul, who taught nothing but the hope of Israel found in Moses, the law, and the prophets, saying in Galatians chapter 5, verse 5, according to the Spirit, we eagerly expect the hope of righteousness. Where do you suppose Paul, drawing from the Tanakh, would have such a hope of everlasting righteousness being established and coming at the parousia? Look, folks, I probably don't have to tell you. Amillennialists, postmillennialists, dispensationalists agree on a tremendous consensus. To establish everlasting righteousness is the resurrection, it is the kingdom, it is the new heaven and the new earth. In my book, 70 weeks are determined, quote, quote, or ... for the resurrection. I document this from a plethora of scholarship citations. So here is Paul, and by the way, he said, we are eagerly looking for the hope of righteousness. Well, the word that he uses there, eagerly expecting, is from apekdekomai. And it is an eager expectant looking for. It is not, well, one of these days, yeah, it'll happen maybe, sort of, kind of. No. Apekdekomai is based upon a realistic expectation. So we might ask the question, a question that F.F. Bruce answers in his little book, The Time is Fulfilled. When Jesus came saying, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near, Jesus said the time, the appointed time, and F.F. Bruce says, what Jesus was saying here is that there was a long anticipated, predicted time for the kingdom to come, and he points out, F.F. Bruce does, that the Old Testament prophecy, that the most clearly set forth, that the most clearly established a time for the establishment of the kingdom is Daniel 9:24 through 27. I believe that's what Paul is drawing on. I believe that Paul, just like Jesus, was well aware of the fact he was living in the time for the fulfillment of the 70 weeks, and the 70 weeks predicted the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Not only that, I'm not going to be able to get through all of this, so I'll put it off to next week as well. But what was Peter looking for? Well, number one, his doctrine of the day of the Lord and the new heaven and new earth was from the Old Testament and the other apostles and Jesus. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And he said, according to his promise, we look for a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. Well, guess what? That means he's drawing directly on Isaiah 65 and 66, which predicted the coming of the new heaven and new earth. But Daniel, writing after Isaiah 65 and 66, was looking for the establishment of that world, that new heaven and new earth, wherein dwells everlasting righteousness, foretold by the prophets. No other prophet so clearly enunciates this, quote, hope of everlasting righteousness than does Daniel. And finally, Revelation 21 and 22. New heaven, new earth. What is there? Well, it doesn't quote Daniel, but it draws on it. Because this is the world where Jesus, who is our righteousness, dwells. So what we're saying here, ladies and gentlemen, is Paul, Peter, and John were looking for the arrival of the world of everlasting righteousness, and Daniel 9 foretold the arrival of the world of everlasting righteousness. And Paul, Peter, and John were living in the time that if you do the math, if you do the calculations, just like Jesus said, the time, the appointed time had arrived. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, this completely, totally annuls the foundational argument of Mr. Hodge in his book, in which he claims that one of the greatest problems of preterism is our failure to see that Daniel does not predict Jesus, does not predict the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, does not predict the New Testament times at all, but rather was speaking of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen, very carefully. This is my close for today. I'll pick it up again next week. But everlasting righteousness was not established in the days and in the events of Antiochus Epiphanes. Everlasting righteousness was not fully established by the Maccabees and reconquering the temple, reconquering the city. It just didn't happen. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me. Listen, go to my website. Order yourself a copy of 70 Weeks Are Determined, ... for the resurrection. Or purchase the book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, Future or Fulfilled. Both of those books, I discuss whether or not Daniel 9 was predictive of Antiochus Epiphanes or Jesus himself. All right? Be sure to join me tonight with Mike Sullivan as we continue our study of the Song of Moses and New Testament eschatology. Thanks again for joining me. I'll see you tonight.